Hey y'all, it's good to be with you. I'm from Texas, so that's how we greet people. Uh, but really, good evening. So glad you've chosen to be with us. I'll give more context to this video in a minute. But my name is Elizabeth Leonani Coffey, and I am the managing director here at the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. I have the joy of working alongside some wonderful colleagues who greeted you on your way in, who you'll get to hear from up here on the stage in a little bit. But the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving is here at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and we're proud of it. I want to begin simply by saying how grateful we are that you chose to be here tonight, spending your evening with us. I also want to acknowledge the many communities that you represent. We're especially grateful for the habitat leaders who are here, who chose, that are from around the region and who are spending your evening with us. We're honored to welcome students, faculty, and staff from the university. And we're pleased that Dean Pasek is here, I believe, somewhere in here. Yay, hello. Good to see you. So glad that you're here. Dean Pasek is the Dean of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And we're thankful for the many faith leaders here in this space, nonprofit leaders, philanthropic leaders, and community members who care deeply about the well-being of our communities. And so thank you for being here. Your presence already says something really important, that conversations about faith, generosity, and the future of our communities matters deeply. And so thank you. We're also grateful to be gathered at the Heron School of Art and Design, a place where creativity and community meet, so it felt fitting for tonight's conversation. Just before I stepped up here, you watched this great video about our executive certificate in religious fundraising, one of Lake's flagship educational programs. The program reflects something central to who we are. At Lake, we are both a research institute and a teaching institute. We study generosity and we equip leaders to practice it faithfully and effectively. And tonight's conversation grows out of that same commitment. Lake is embedded, like I already mentioned, within the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, the world's first school dedicated solely to the study and teaching of philanthropy. Within that school, we are one of 5 institutes and initiatives that together explore dimensions of generosity and civil society. Alongside Lake are the Women's Philanthropy Institute, the Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy, the Higher Education Philanthropy Initiative, and the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative. Each of these institutes plays a vital role in helping shape how generosity, in claiming and talking about how generosity takes shape across cultures and communities and traditions. And at Lake, we explore that role, the role that faith specifically plays in shaping generosity, leadership, and the well-being of communities. Through research, education, and public dialogue, we work to strengthen faith communities, deepen partnerships between philanthropy and religious life, and elevate generosity as a force that sustains both institutions as well as our neighborhoods. We exist to ensure that the relationship between faith and giving is not treated as peripheral to public life, but that we recognize it as central to it. And one of the questions that continues to guide and animate our work is, how do faith communities and faith-inspired leaders help shape a more generous and flourishing society? We ask not only what we give, but why we give and how we belong and what kind of communities we are building together. And few organizations embody those questions more concretely than Habitat for Humanity. When many people think about Habitat, you probably think about houses, rightly so, but Habitat's work has always been more than just construction. It's about dignity, it's about stability, and it's about neighbors choosing to invest in another person's future. At its best, it reflects a deeply faith-rooted idea that generosity is not charity offered at a distance, but partnership practiced in proximity. Tonight, we'll explore how faith, leadership, and generosity intersect in shaping communities where people can truly thrive, and what that means in a moment when many of our social bonds feel strained and our shared future can feel uncertain. A quick word about how tonight will work. Throughout the conversation, you will see a QR code on the screen. and you're invited to use it at any time throughout tonight to submit questions that arise. So we invite curiosity. We want you to participate with us. Those questions will be gathered and curated for our audience Q&A section at the end of the evening. My colleague in the back, Tasha Gibson, our senior program manager at the Lake Institute, will be moderating that portion of the conversation. Tasha helps steward many of Lake's public programs and learning experiences, and we're grateful for the care and wisdom that she brings creating meaningful dialogue. Guiding tonight's interview is someone that many of you already know, Dr. David King, the Karen Lake Buttrey Director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. David's work has helped shape national conversations about faith-based philanthropy, generosity, and the evolving role of religious communities in public life. More importantly, or just as importantly, he is a thoughtful convener and someone deeply committed to creating conversations that are both intellectually rich and deeply human. David will serve as the moderator tonight. And now it's my privilege to introduce our featured guest, which many of you got to take pictures with, as I observed, have great conversations with, eat some cheese and crackers alongside of. Jonathan Reckford has served as CEO of Habitat for Humanity International since 2005. He's leading one of the most recognized global movements for affordable housing and community transformation. Under his leadership, Habitat has expanded its reach to serve millions of families worldwide while continuing to center partnership, dignity, and faith as core drivers of its mission. Jonathan brings a rare combination of global leadership experience, moral clarity, and practical wisdom shaped by work across the nonprofit, business, and faith sectors. But perhaps most importantly, he has helped remind the world that housing is not only an economic issue, it is a human one connected to belonging, opportunity, and a hope. So please join me in welcoming to the stage our moderator, Dr. David King, and our guest for the evening, Jonathan Reckford.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for being here. And Jonathan, thank you for being here with us, making the trip from Atlanta. We brought this wonderful, beautiful weather that you would bring some of what you have our way. We would really appreciate it. We really can't thank you enough for being here and for thinking with us about how we can talk about these topics that Elizabeth alluded to so eloquently around faith, leadership, building communities. And for those of us who may not know Habitat's full story, it's been around for over 50 years now, 50 years of building homes, communities, and hope. I wonder if you might just start by telling us a bit about Habitat's beginnings and how it's developed.
It's really a wonderful story, and this is our 50th year, so we've been thinking a lot about that. And it's really a story of faith. The story starts with a relatively unknown but extraordinary leader named Clarence Jordan, who started an interracial farm in South Georgia in 1942. And he was way ahead of his time. And that was not very popular in Southwest Georgia in 1942. And the farm was really never a commercial success. It's called Koinonia Farm, from the Greek word for Christian community. And they set a model of really equality and service, but they were bombed, boycotted, harassed, and generally made unwelcome all the way along. And but he trained a whole generation of pastors on nonviolent social protest. He was an extraordinary teacher. He actually wrote a colloquial translation of the New Testament in Southern vernacular called the Cotton Patch Gospel, which is remarkable and well worth reading. And in the 60s, the farm was really struggling, and he pulled a group together to pray for a week. And out of that came an extraordinarily prophetic letter. And in it, he laid out the case for a fund for humanity. And the first expression of that was to be around housing, working with sharecropping farmers living in these terrible shacks. And the idea was they would come alongside these sharecropping farmers, help them build a proper, very simple home, give them a no-profit 20-year loan, and then they would pay back the loan and then keep, in the spirit of Christian community, keep making payments so the fund for humanity would be sustainable and be able to keep on, as each family paid, they would help the next family have their opportunity to get financing. And a social entrepreneur named Millard Fuller was part of that group. He'd come to Koinonia Farm to rescue his marriage. And he grabbed the idea. They tested it with a handful of houses on that farm. And then he took it as a missionary with Disciples of Christ to what was then Zaire, now Congo, and tested it for 3 years. And then in 1976, came back to the United States, and the Fund for Humanity became Habitat for Humanity, and that was the official start. And there was a quote I've always loved that I think fits tonight's conversation so nicely in that letter, and I reread it often, but there were a lot of remarkable things in it. But what he said is, what the poor need is not charity, but capital, not caseworkers, but co-workers. And what the rich need is a wise, honorable, and just way of divesting themselves of their overabundance. And I think that's such a lovely phrase. And he had a vision that everyone had something to give and something to gain when they worked together, and and in a way that really is the ethos of Habitat. Now, if you can indulge me for a moment, and greetings to our Habitat friends in the room. If you ask most people at Habitat for Humanity, the good news is most people smile. It's like, oh, Habitat. So there's this warm halo around our work, which is wonderful. And then if you ask people what they know about Habitat, they know two things, both of which turn out not to be true. They know that Jimmy Carter started and runs it, and that we give away houses. They're often very surprised to find out the model, as I've just talked about, has always been that idea of partnership housing. I think a lot of people are also surprised that the overwhelming majority of our work happens outside the United States. So we work in almost 70 countries around the world in a wide variety of contexts, and that we have expanded dramatically off of that core work. We're still very much empowered by that deep work in local communities. But we also recognized many years ago that we were never going to build enough houses to solve the housing problem. And Habitat's vision is a world where everyone has a decent place to live. Everyone's a really big number. And so we actually calculated how many years would it take at compounding our quite fast growth rate to actually solve the housing problem. And I think it was something like 1,032 years, which felt unacceptably slow. So that really changed our framing question from how many houses can we build, which was a good question, to what would it take to actually address the housing need in all the geographies we serve, which is a much more audacious question. And that led us into policy and advocacy work and into what we call market development, and really thinking about how could we actually make markets and systems work better for low and moderate income families so they could improve their own housing conditions. And then ultimately reframed our volunteer work. How many of you have ever volunteered with Habitat? So, oh, look at that. That's awesome. Thank you. How many of you are highly skilled construction workers? Yeah. Oh, we got one. So it's so in a way, if we just want to build houses, building with unskilled volunteers is not the most efficient way to build houses. But if we want to change society, it actually is fundamentally important. And so in a way, we want to do more volunteering than ever, but with the spirit of how do we change the hearts of those volunteers in such a way that they become agents in helping us change the enabling environment, so we have better policies that allow markets to work better for families so that Habitat and others can build more houses. And that's the big picture. And that started allowing us to move from what was originally tens and hundreds to thousands to millions of people around the world each year. But we have a long way to go. So that was a long answer, sorry, but a little bit of context.
I really appreciate that. And one thing that was oftentimes surprising to me was the global reach of Habitat, but also maybe just that refocused on sort of the broader problem, the engagement with advocacy and policy. What you sort of mentioned, what we might know about Habitat, Jimmy Carter on a build, but what oftentimes do you run up against is, the questions you get, the most surprising thing that maybe you wanted to share that you're excited about the way Habitat has evolved?
Well, maybe I can just give a couple of examples of because what that might look like. So on our first giant advocacy area was property rights, and something we often take for granted. But even in the U.S., there are families that may have generations of folks living and don't have clean titles or clean, and that's an issue. But outside the U.S., there are many places where women and marginalized groups don't have the right to their land. And if you don't have the right to stay, it doesn't make sense to invest in upgrading your housing. So we have worked in many, many countries around establishing property rights for mostly for women and disadvantaged groups. And that's a huge prerequisite. I would say one things I'm really excited about is increasing access to housing finance. And Habitat started out as a lender because no one would lend to the families that we lend to, but Real Scale would be getting the market to lend to those families at fair rates. And so we actually helped create a new asset class in housing microfinance and started lending money and training microfinance banks on how to do home improvement loans for very low income families. And that is now scaled where we've helped tens of millions of people be able to upgrade their housing through being able to obtain small loans. And so a couple of examples. On the first one in Bolivia, one of my favorite examples, we trained this cadre of women. Their women didn't have the right to own their property. And you think about divorce, inheritance, abuse, all the things that can go wrong with that. And not only did this powerhouse group of women get their rights, they actually got the federal law changed. So if a man owned and wanted to register his house or his land and he was married, it had to be joint titled. So that meant 1.8 million women suddenly were enabled to be property owners and asset holders. Now, real success is when they all actually get those titles, but that's a very tangible example of changing the enabling environment. On the housing microfinance, after a bunch of tests, we actually raised a wholesale fund, a debt fund, and we raised $100 million about 12 years ago. And we just wound down that fund, and we're going to try to raise a bigger one. But these numbers are pretty amazing. 10 million of equity, 90 million of debt. We've loaned it out 2.5 cycles. So we loaned out $230 million to 56 microfinance banks in 33 countries, then trained them on how to start housing portfolios. That directly helped 1.1 million people upgrade their housing. But even better, the banks that we trained and capitalized initially have put in 1.1 billion of their capital now. So that means millions more every year are having access to loans, and we're starting to see the market start to provide access to families that were generally viewed as uncreditworthy or too risky to give loans to. So that's an example. And then you could then we go into building materials, then we go into skilled labor and start to creating a system where the whole value chain works for families to be able to upgrade their housing. One of the interesting but too early to declare victory things we're doing is how do you then train the family if they can stay on their land and get a loan? How do they know how to hire a mason and manage? For all of us, doing a home renovation is a pretty terrifying experience. And we've tried all kinds of different ways of training. And this is early but fascinating. In the Philippines, Peru, and Kenya, we're doing web-based, phone-based home improvement television. And it's actually reaching millions of people very cost effectively. So we're still messing around with it. But if you have two of our big giant champions in the US are Jonathan and Drew Scott, the Property Brothers. And so that was sort of if you can picture a very simplified version of how to fix up your house in an entertaining way. We're working on that. So those are just a few examples that you wouldn't necessarily expect us to be doing. And we've got a number of affiliates here. We've had to get much more sophisticated around finance. We've had to figure out new ways of working in partnership. And the language we used when we started that shift was that we wanted to put Christ's love into action by being a partner and catalyst for worldwide access to safe, decent, affordable housing. And we chose those words very carefully, and we can unpack a little bit because complicated things can only be solved through partnership. And we wanted the work we were doing to be catalytic, that it would be a demonstration of what's possible rather than the answer, because we know we're just one tiny piece of what it'll take to solve such a big problem.
I want to get in just a minute to really that question around the mission and identity of Habitat. But I'm grateful. I fixed a lot of things around the house by watching some YouTube channel, and I'm going to check out some of these actually when we get home. I was at a conference just a few weeks ago, and I was talking with a friend whose husband had retired and found his new vocation in opening up a restaurant, and she was super excited that she found 100 new dinner plates for the restaurant at a restore for Habitat. As you've grown so large, we're the School of Philanthropy, so I feel like this is the question that's fair to ask. Think about the philanthropic or economic models as you've grown so much as an organization. Tell us what that looks like a bit and how you think.
Thank you, David. I often describe us as leveraged philanthropy because for all nonprofits, ultimately, you have to have a revenue engine. How do you keep that funding coming in year after year? And And I think for our affiliates, it becomes a blend, and that's worked really well. You mentioned a lot of people aren't aware of our Habitat for Humanity restores. That's actually a really nice story, primarily North America, though we have them in Australia, New Zealand, Ireland and Northern Ireland, Philippines, and a few places in Europe, other places in Europe. But these are essentially housing thrift stores, and we have 1,000 stores now, and that's a 750 million in revenue last year. And those funds then recycle into the local communities to help build more houses. And then we have the families paying mortgages, so those mortgage payments are recycling back into their communities to help build houses. But that's all fueled then by philanthropy, and so that I think our healthy affiliates can blend those pieces together. And we're finding it's a mix of private sector. In our case, our largest two probably base levels are individual giving and corporate giving. We're not as strong. We don't tend to get as much on the government and institutional side, though I'd say for our US affiliates, government's become a bigger piece in the last 5 years as the gap between what it costs to create a home and what families can afford has become the widest really in modern history. And so we're having to work more closely. And I actually think any big complex thing requires public sector, private sector, and civil society working together. But it is, I think on us, as it is for every nonprofit, to sort of demonstrate that we are going to be good stewards, that those dollars can have impact. I would say one other growth area for us is, and maybe this is a broader issue for philanthropy, for a lot of time, donors just felt good giving money, and they felt, I'm giving money, it's a good cause, and I feel happy. There's been a move toward a much higher expectation of measuring impact, and I think that's a great thing. And in a way, Habitat's gone down that same journey from outputs to outcomes to impact. And in a way, the home has all kinds of things, but the impact turns out to be very heavily around better health outcomes, better educational outcomes. Interestingly, a lot of psychological outcomes. It turns out stability is incredibly important for childhood development. And then some ones you would surprise. I mean, some really cool things. We have something I'm super excited about right now is we did a longitudinal test in Kenya with some major health organizations around malaria. And we have demonstrated now, and it just was a major finding in a large medical journal, that relatively small physical interventions on the house around screening created a 77% reduction in malaria-bearing insects. And we also reduced the heat index to make the houses more livable for the families. That's a massive medical finding for about $170 investment. But we find people care more about housing if we can show those connections to all the other outcomes. So we're having to do more. But Habitat, thanks to many people like you, has gotten big. Last year, if you added all of our entities together, it was about 3.1 billion in total revenue. But the need is still a whole lot bigger than that.
Well, we have a lot of students who are practicing or budding leaders in the nonprofit field. We have a number of leaders in our community and beyond. As someone who's done this for decades now and has been a nonprofit CEO of the year, sit around the table with other nonprofit leaders, I'd love if you talk a little bit about sort of what are some of the leadership not secrets, but formative moments, I think, for you over this journey, like how things have sort of changed over time and as the organization has evolved and as you've seen the sector change as well.
Thank you. It's interesting. I actually love talking to students, and I've been in a couple of student environments in the last month. And, I'm going to go actually before Habitat. I was incredibly blessed with some amazing role models, and I had two unbelievable women in my life. And my grandmother was one of the very few women in the U.S. Congress when I was a child. And her name was Millicent Fenwick, and she was a ferocious fighter for civil and human rights. She led the civil rights campaign for the state of New Jersey before going into public service. And she, every time I saw her, she would quote her favorite verse in the Bible, which was Micah 6:8, maybe very familiar to many of you. He has shown you, man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And then she would ask me what I was going to do to be useful. And that was her view of the good life. And that's a pretty good encapsulation of the good life. We're supposed to be useful. And it took me a long time to figure out how to be useful. My career never made sense. I I was going to go to law school to go into politics to be like her. And suddenly it came to the shocking realization my senior year in college, I had no interest in being a lawyer. I just thought that's what you did to get to politics. And so I and talked my way into a job at Goldman Sachs on Wall Street that was totally unqualified for and suffered mightily for that. And there are a couple inflection points. And I think when I look back, some of my leadership lessons are less what's on the resume, but more in the white spaces. And I think that's where God does a lot of work. So one giant inflection point was I was pretty miserable on Wall Street and wanted to regain perspective. And I went off through a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. And Luce was the founder of Time Magazine, and his parents were missionaries in China. And he sends, still now for 50 years, sends young Americans off to work in Asia. And I had the chance to do marketing work for the Seoul Olympics. And then, longer story, I'm not going to tell, ended up coaching the Korean rowing team in preparation for the '88 games. So I lived in the training camp with all the Korean coaches and athletes, and no internet, no email, no total immersion in another culture. And that was the year I had enough space to really own my faith as an adult. And God put the right person in my life that year. And so that was really an inflection point. And then I look back, and all the different jobs I had after that were all valuable. But the next big inflection point was when I wasn't working. The company I was helping lead got bought. I had a chance. I'd always wanted to go into the nonprofit sector. I went to business school when only a couple of business schools were teaching that we needed professional management in nonprofits, now a very mainstream idea. And then when I got out of business school, there weren't many career paths in nonprofits for MBAs. I'm old. This was a long time ago. And so my new thought was, okay, I'll go to the private sector, learn a bunch of skills, and then go to the nonprofit sector. And I went off on a short-term mission trip right after I'd left the private sector, and God just broke my heart. I was in rural India, serving alongside the Bungi, and among the Dalits in India, this is supposed to be illegal, still practiced. These are families who, just by nature of their birth, weren't allowed to live in community, were social outcasts. They could only hand clean latrines and clean up dead animals. And about half the kids were dying before their 13th birthday. And it just shattered me. And I came back kind of on fire, and I was like, okay, I'm done with the business world. Turned down a couple of good business jobs, almost got a couple of nonprofit jobs, did not get them because I'd never run a nonprofit, which actually makes perfect sense in hindsight. And I was like, come on, God, we had a deal. I was going to turn down my business, and you were going to give me my perfect job that met all of my ego gratification, financial, family, social, geographic, and other long list of criteria. And suddenly everything got quiet. And basically what I heard from God was he cared much more about my character than my job. And that led to a long period of just waiting. And it was great for my family, terrible for my ego, or great and terrible for my ego. And my volunteer work had been helping churches grow, while my professional work had been helping grow businesses. And to my great surprise, my local church asked if I would come and serve as the executive pastor, administrative pastor of the church. Everybody I trusted for career advice said, don't do that. That was daunting. But my wife, Ashley, and I prayed about it. We had a real strong sense of that's what I was supposed to do. And I had said after saying to God, okay, God, no conditions, best I can, I'm just going to say yes. It felt like this is what we were supposed to do. And this is such a God part. Right about when I was deciding that, got a call from one of the big search firms with an amazing opportunity. I had no idea if I would have gotten it, to run an internet retailer. And I just remember telling the headhunter, that sounds incredible. I'm going to go work for my local church. And thought, I will never, I'm off the market, blacklisted, never to be heard from again. 2 years later, happily working in the church. And same headhunter calls, totally out of the blue. Jonathan, do you know anybody who'd be interested in Habitat for Humanity? And I just remember the adrenaline went down my back, and I got really quiet. It's like, does it have to be somebody famous? Because I thought Jimmy Carter runs Habitat. Why is he still? And long story, went home, wrote a 2-page letter saying, I don't know if I'm the right person for this, but I think this is the kind of thing God's been preparing me for my whole life. And then there was a long waiting period, and suddenly it all accelerated. And I'm driving past cotton fields on the way to Plains, Georgia, to interview with President Carter, and it all happened. And I can honestly say, my favorite definition of vocation is from Frederick Buechner, and I think this can tie so much to for what your students are studying, but he said, your vocation or calling is that place where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. And I love that imagery, when the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. And boy, we have a lot of needs, but it's so interesting because I don't think Habitat would have chosen me had I not had that time of seasoning and serving in the church. And I also believe if I'd said, I'm going to go work in the church so I can get my perfect job, and then ironically, Habitat met every one of that ridiculous list of criteria I had, including getting my Southern wife back to the South after 7 Minnesota winters. But so it's so interesting to see in the rear view mirror how some of those can work. And I didn't mean to go that far sideways, but I would say, from a leadership lessons at Habitat, I always describe to our new executive directors and country directors, is deceptively complex. It sounds so simple. We just get a bunch of people together and build houses, but all the elements of actually doing that turn out to be a lot of work, including raising the money to make that happen. And a few of my axioms I'll share. One is to be religious about your principles, but not your tactics. And this has been a deep one. So we want to hold tight to our principles, but not to our tactics. And I think sometimes in mission-driven work, we get those mixed up, and you see some of the biggest tension because one person's tactic is another person's what they're thinking about principle, and you've got to unpack that and figure out that you're holding on to your values but shifting in your tactics. And right when I joined, which I never would wish for, we had just had the Indian Ocean tsunami, which was one of the world's greatest housing disasters. And literally about 3 days before I was supposed to start work, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, which was one of the US's biggest housing disasters. And it was horrific in both cases. But I would say if you can bring good out of bad, the scale of the crisis gave us both resources and urgency to tip some sacred cows and do things. Habitat was built to build a few houses in a million places, and suddenly we needed a lot of houses in a few places. And that meant we had to do some things very differently. But that also created some of the seeds of what became our scaling strategy, because we had the freedom to do things that probably would have been culturally very difficult without such a large crisis. So I think certainly learned a lot about that. And sadly, we have had too many crises to respond to over the years. I think the other is learning about federations. And, churches are part of denominations. They have their complexity. Federated organizations are powerful and complex because there's a great strength to local ownership. And I would not change that. I think it's really, especially for housing is inherently local. So you want the people working on housing to be in your community and of your community so that they can solve problems and the issues. But it also creates complexity if we have nearly 1,000 independent chapters in the US and then all these different countries. Getting everybody aiming in the same direction sometimes has its challenges too.
That's really helpful, and I think a really encouraging word. I think for all of us and our students and those of us who are finding our way into this work, sort of chasing after finding that, as you noted in that Buechner quote, but looking back in the rearview mirror and seeing how all of these experiences lead us to where we are going. I mean, another key point of our work at Lake Institute is really focused, as Elizabeth alluded to, in sort of the great assets that faith bring to faith-based organizations across the nonprofit sector and in communities. Faith-based organizations come in all shapes and sizes across all sorts of spectrum approaches. But thinking about Habitat, and what ways would you sort of identify or think of Habitat as a faith-based organization, and maybe what lessons have you learned in a wide sea of that conversation that's really continued to be reimagined about the role of faith in the nonprofit sector?
Thank you. I think this is such a big thing, and our society isn't dealing with any complexity very well right now. It feels like we are. I tend to see the world increasingly as I'm now much older in shades of gray, and I think we have everything being pushed into black and white polarization. And Habitat, I should have said, when I joined, we actually had a mission statement that was full of really good stuff, but no one could say it because it was about a paragraph long and no one could remember it. And so we tried to get to the essence of what was most important out of all the good things in it. And we boiled that down to our mission statement is we seek to put God's love into action by bringing people together to build homes, communities, and hope. And if you unpack that into the pieces, our motivation, our why, is to put God's love into action. So we would view ourselves as a Christian ministry, and a radically inclusive one. And we can talk about living in the tension of trying to be both of those well. Our methodology, which actually I think is such a beautiful part of Habitat's work, is bringing people together. And we can talk about all the different contexts, but I think something deep in the spirit of Habitat from the very beginning, where in Koinonia Farm, bringing people together across race, but we have brought people together across every kind of difference around the world. And I love that. And then the impact we're trying to have in the world is to build homes, communities, and hope. And I love that the last thing we added was hope, because for some people that feels very soft and intangible. But actually, I think that gets really to the heart of what faith in action is really about, which is that sense of for families and for communities, a vision of a better way to be together and a better life together.
We do have all shapes and sizes of faith-based organizations, but leaning into Habitat's sort of unique ability to work across difference. I think if we read the headlines, we see oftentimes maybe religious is a leader in sort of maybe into division, polarization, but how in particular has Habitat really been a transformational voice in sort of bridging difference in the work that you do?
You know, a wise person said many generations ago, there are problems you solve and tensions you manage. And I find that really helpful for some of these issues, because to me, I think of Habitat remaining unapologetically Christian and radically inclusive is living in a tension. And how do we live in both sides? And I've seen, we're so diverse. We have affiliates that have leaned so far into inclusion, they've kind of lost the faith side. Sometimes you've seen, though more rare, leaning so deeply into faith that they could do better on the inclusion side. And we're deeply committed to and anchored in both sides. A phrase we've used for many, many years that I love is that God is our center, but not our border. And I like the imagery of that it's out of our relationship and our desire to share God's love. That's the why, but we do that with open hands and everybody's welcome. And I think that's so important. And I can just tell, I could tell stories for ages, but I've seen some almost miraculous things, and in a way, because Habitat's not a church, and of course, we need churches, synagogues, temples, and everyone else to be part of the solution. And I'm a faith optimist. I know there's a lot of folks out there saying faith is causing problems in the world. That's human beings causing problems in the world, misapplying their faith. Not that the faith is causing the problems in the world, in my perspective. But I think just a few snapshots. Habitat built the first mixed race community after apartheid in South Africa, which is pretty amazing. I love this. I was a couple of years ago, I was in Northern Ireland and Ireland for our 40th anniversary of working in those countries. And it happened to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland. And it's not a very well-known story, but the day before they signed the Accords, Tony Blair and the British team spent a day building a Habitat house with Gerry Adams and the Sinn Féin team. And all the houses in Belfast were built by Protestants and Catholics building together. And there's something about when you physically go out and do something together with people that appeals to your shared values that can be transformative. One of my other heroes is Desmond Tutu, who sponsored our work in South Africa. And he said a quote I've always loved, which is, as the physical walls of the house go up, the invisible walls that separate us as people come tumbling down, and hope is built in the community. And I love that image. And we have done peace building in Mindanao in the Philippines with between Muslims and Christians there. We've built with Coptic Christians and Muslims in Egypt. We built with Hindus and Muslims in India, which is a big barrier. And I've just seen over and over, we have even built with Democrats and Republicans. So it is, and I don't know what the equivalent would be. I usually joke that I'm a North Carolina grad, so I actually am deeply jealous of that you could win the football championship. I have to say that basketball schools usually aren't supposed to be good at football, so that's very impressive. But it is, I do think at our best, service can be the antidote to a lot of the polarization we see in our society, because I do think it's Bill Urey, if anybody's have read Getting to Yes, great book around negotiation. He helped start the Harvard Negotiation Project, and a mutual friend introduced us. And he had a whole theory that he does a lot of conflict negotiation. And one of his theories is if you have a hard thing to talk about, don't sit across a table from one another. Go for a walk together. And he said, because then you're shoulder to shoulder, you're looking in the same direction, you're having the shared experience. It's like even better, go build a habitat house together because do something literally constructive, and that allows you to reframe a little bit that other and create a space where you can connect.
I think, I think I've heard him even here in this space, our mutual friend Ibu Patel, Interfaith America, Interfaith Youth Court might maybe have sort of one of the sparks for his organization is somewhat similar and probably built on the back, I think, of the Habitat model of instead of having a dialogue with a panel of people across religious traditions, what if we're picking up hammers and working side by side? Yeah.
It's so important. Ibu's a great friend, and I'm such a fan. And for you don't know, he started actually, I think it was a Habitat experience in college that was a little bit of the beginning, but he created something called the Interfaith Youth Corps that is now Interfaith America. And we're doing a great project together that's still early, but with Catholic Charities, the YMCA, Habitat, and Interfaith America. And we're using service intentionally around bridge building. And we've trained cohorts of service leaders on bridge building techniques. And now we have 2 whole cohorts. So we have 20 cities where we're doing this for Habitat. And Ibu, he has the imagery of this metaphor I love. He said, instead of talking about a melting pot, think about a potluck supper. And I think that's so helpful to think about, because in a potluck supper, everybody brings their best dish and you have a feast together, but nobody has to give up who they are in order to work together. And I think that's one of the mistakes that sometimes is made. And we do a ton of interfaith work, which I love. I absolutely love. And one of the ways we've done that I've seen interfaith work poorly is where some well-intended people say we have to get together and agree on some theological statement before we can do anything. It's a disaster, and it's actually offensive in a way to many people who are observant. I think the flip, which I've seen so powerfully, is that no one has to give up who they are, but when we come together and think about doing things together around our shared values, we can celebrate our difference. And I had the incredible privilege about 6 weeks ago, one of the highlights of the year for me, I was able to moderate the interfaith dinner at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And we had sort of the most amazing group of speakers and from all different faith traditions around the world. And we designed it to only do storytelling. And I just wish everyone could have heard these stories, because we had such a mix. We had a head of the Reformed Jewish tradition. We had the Secretary General of the Muslims. We had the exiled president of Belarus talking about her faith helped her get through as her husband was arrested and she was kicked out of the country. We had an Israeli astronaut who spent a year in this space station. Talk about having to get along with people that are different in a really confined environment. We had this wonderful Buddhist monk who runs a center in Japan that's remarkable. And all the stories were of shared humanity and people coming together. And I could tell stories for days, but I do think we need a whole lot more of that, and we need those stories. And if people can get sort of off their screens and into their communities, I think we can see real transformation happen.
And I love that team up model and the ways that Habitat's embodied that. I'm thinking particularly with what we've seen, and a lot of this has come from research that many have done, and the School of Philanthropy has helped to produce some of this as well. But one of those is being sort of a declines in giving, not in absolute dollars, but percentages of Americans who are participating by giving, by volunteering. And it seems like that, there's a serious question, I think, of how we build or maintain the threads of civil society. I'd love to get your thoughts on those kinds of questions.
Yeah, this is deeply worrying, and I think giving is a symptom of the bigger problem. So it's not the problem in itself, but it's a reflection of the fact that people are so disconnected from their communities. And I was in a conversation with Bob Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone and then Upswing, and something that was interesting is historically when we had industrial revolutions, they coincided with spiritual renewal movements. And I was talking to one of your faculty members about it here in Indiana, and many places in the late end of the 19th century, there was a whole movement that coincided with the Industrial Revolution, and it was the beginning of many of the big big nonprofits we think of now today in terms of the community chest, which became United Way, in terms of mutual insurance companies and many of these social movements. I think we desperately need that again now. And I would say that one of the many contributions from your school is the Giving USA, which is incredibly useful for all of our sector. But last year, for those who aren't familiar, first time ever since they've been doing this study, that fewer than half of Americans gave anything to charity. And I think that's really worrying. And the dollars are getting made up by the very wealthy giving more, but it's not a healthy sign for society. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that people are less engaged in their faith communities, people are less engaged in their communities, period, in terms of service organizations, community groups. And I think COVID was an exacerbator of these trends that are fairly long-term trends. But it's really worrisome when we think about the health of society, because I do think giving is actually a reflection of connection, and that people are so isolated and disconnected, that's translating into, it's also the K economy. We have to be practical. We've also got a world where those with assets are doing really well and those without assets are doing really poorly. But my experience is that's different than whether you give. Often I've seen people with very little be very generous. And I think that, so I worry more deeply that the issue is connection, and we can talk about things. We were talking earlier that, if I had a magic wand, I'd have every high schooler go do a year of service after high school with people that are different, and because we don't need them all to serve in the Army, but recreating context where everyone had some experience outside their community. But that's a big one to solve.
I've just got a couple more questions, but I think I just want to sort of remind folks, if they have a question, just to remember that the QR code's up there, because we'll want to bring your questions in here in just a minute. On that topic of sort of, I'm thinking about it's across generations, but maybe even more so with the younger generation, sort of declines of participation, but also declines in institutional trust. And sort of leading a large scale nonprofit, working with a lot of corporate, government, nonprofit partners. What would you say to us about thinking about sort of institutions and how we might reimagine whether different types of institutions, or how to what should the nonprofit sector know about sort of those questions around institutional trust for a new generation?
No, it's such a huge issue, because I think we're in a long period of anti-institutionalism. And the worrisome thing about that is not to defend every institution, but it's easy to tear stuff down, and it's really hard to build. So building strong institutions takes decades sometimes. And yet now we're in a world where they can be destroyed very, very quickly. And I think that low trust ties to we were talking about before in terms of low connection, but it's really worrisome. And nonprofits are generally held in a little higher regard, but everyone's numbers are going down. And what scares me a little bit, journalists are trusted even less than members of Congress, who are really not trusted. And businesses are trusted a little bit more, and nonprofits a little bit more, but worrisome, the overall rates are concerning. And I think it's something, back to how do we reconnect? I think for those of us in the nonprofit sector, how do we make sure we're telling our story? How do we have transparency, demonstrate? I'm a huge fan of professionalizing our sector. I mean, I believe that for decades now, because historically we have a lot of not very well run nonprofits, and that's not actually okay. And I think we want to keep raising the bar and have very high expectations. But we also need some grace in our society. And I think in a way, I'm going to oversimplify, but the problem today is the media incentives are broken. This is my personal opinion, not Habitat's. So if you're media today, you need eyeballs. The way you get eyeballs is making people scared and upset. So you tend to focus on negative things and frightening people. And then if you want to get into politics, the way you get media is to make people scared and upset. So you want to be as extreme as possible and get people as upset as possible. So we have these echo chambers pushing people further and further out to the edges, and not telling the story that I get all this Pew data. 2/3 of the country agree on almost everything, and you would never know that because the things that most everybody agree on aren't typically pushed by the far edges of either side. And so I do think it can be solvable, but it's going to be, I think, really it's on all of us, I think, to be those bridge builders, because I think the bridge building ties a little bit to trust in institutions, and And we've also got to rebuild and protect our institutions. And this is really an extraordinary time of anti-institutionalism. And I worry because it's, you think about the war right now. I remember Tahrir Square in Egypt and when the Middle East was going through all the changes 12, 14 years ago. And I remember our teams were so excited because they were going to get rid of Mubarak in Egypt. And I remember thinking, well, that's good, but what happens afterwards? Everyone could agree on throwing out the current leader. There was no agreement on what would replace. And sadly, I would say in a lot of these places, what replaced it was worse, not better. And we've ended up with more populist authoritarians everywhere. And that is worrisome. So I do think the flamethrowers can assume you can have all the benefits of our institutions while attacking them. And I would say history would not suggest that that's a safe assumption.
And one last question for me as I invite my colleague Tasha to kind of start to head this way here and lead us through some questions. But Habitat is so articulate, and Elizabeth was as well, as framing these notions of working in housing at the intersection of dignity, justice, and power, hope that's not an empty sentiment, but really sort of textured literally. How do you embody that in the mission of the organization in your work where it doesn't become simply abstract ideas?
Yeah, I know for me, it gets reinforced every time I actually get into the communities and meet with the families. I think one of the principles you heard, but I want to reinforce it, it's so fundamental, is that we build with, not for. And when we work in the communities, we come alongside to support the goals of a community, not to impose our solution on a community, and whether that's in Ethiopia or in Malawi or in Cambodia or in Indiana. And I think that's deeply, deeply important in terms of the dignity piece. And I'm struck sometimes that goes back to the hope, the intangible. I mean, I was in Ethiopia last year. I was thinking about that. And a huge percentage of the families, close to, depending how you measure, 80% of the families are living informally. There's just not enough housing and such high poverty rates in Addis Ababa. And we did one little tiny project, and I was dedicating just families that were living on the street, and we built 2 rows. Land was tough to get. But 2 rows of simple one-room houses with a communal kitchen and communal sanitation facilities. And I met with all the families and spent time. And it was so interesting, one by one, talking to them. And they wildly appreciated some of the physical benefits of a proper house. They could lock a door. They were physically safe. They were protected from the elements. They were dry. They had electricity. Their kids could study. But universally, the number one thing they all said is they were now not ashamed of where they lived, and they could now have friends come in and they could host their friends. And that's dignity. And, I think it is, so we need the tangible, but the intangible, we all have those same, in a way, core desires for us and for our loved ones. And so I think that is, if I can indulge me in a story, I mean, I think, what fires me up are seeing stories of how communities can change over time. And, we tend to, one of my favorite examples from North Carolina, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the Cherry Street community. This was a historic African-American community, had been neglected for a long time. And there are a lot of things that went into that happening. But Habitat sat down with the informal leaders in the community and just started with the question of, what do you want? What do you want for your community? And there were 2 really clear answers. We want this to be a place where families will move back in again as opposed to escaping. And we want this to be safe, do something about the drug and crime problem. And those 2 were related. And Habitat started with a big coalition. And I love this because it really takes everybody. So they brought in all of the area universities. They brought in a bunch of the faith community. They brought in the city and started a project. And Habitat made a commitment to tear down and replace at the entrance to the community 16 really blighted houses that just set the wrong signal when you first came in. And then another nonprofit rehabbed some historically interesting rental housing. And then based on those 2 commitments, some private developers bought some other houses and fixed them up. And we got a new charter school to come in with a principal who was very impressive. And I came in when we were dedicating that first group. And I remember still a policeman named Billy was showing me around. He said, "Hey, if you'd been here 2 years ago, I would have been here to protect you." And it was this big sweep. He was on. He's like, "Now look what we've done." And the city manager said when he gets depressed, he drives through Cherry Street to remember what's possible. And now the affiliate has gone from 16 to 64 to 150 houses that they've built in the area. They moved into the community. They moved the Restore into the community. They offered the family training and financial preparation and all the home construction tools and support to all the families in the community. And it's not perfect, but crime even back then was down 75% in the first 2.5 years. And you could see the change. You could feel it, that people were starting to fix up their houses. They actually believed the community wasn't sinking and a place to escape. They believed now it was a place you'd come back to. So I don't want to candy coat. There's always extra grace required people. It's always messy. But you can actually see real change happen over time if you can get everybody together and get a shared vision of what good could look like.
Thanks, Jonathan. I want to invite my colleague Tasha now. She spent some time in Winston-Salem, and we're both proud IU Hoosiers now, but we also share a little Duke Blue Devil background. So I don't want you to hold that against us.
Well, that's a theological divide now. So.
Let me see if I can build a bridge, though.
There we go.
I think the last time I volunteered with Habitat, and apologies to our local partners, I can't wait to volunteer with y'all. But the last time was in Winston-Salem. And I don't remember the neighborhood, I'm sorry to say, but I remember being deeply impacted by the experience. That would have been 2015, 2016, around there. So we're so happy to have you here. Can we celebrate Jonathan for that part of the conversation? Jonathan, we've received some outstanding questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I can't wait to store them away, share them with your team, share them with our Lake colleagues and our Habitat colleagues, and just keep them in mind and try to be responsive as we can.
And I'll try to give shorter answers. I'm not a...
The first one really struck me, and I would love for us to hear more from you. What was Jimmy Carter like? What was President Jimmy Carter like?
Thank you. You know, one of the great privileges of my life was to get to spend a week every year somewhere in the world with President and Mrs. Carter. And Mrs. Carter is an absolute hero and saint in her own right as well. You know, one of the things I admire most deeply with President Carter is when I think about integrity, it comes from the idea of wholeness. And he was always the same. And whether I was with him with some of the most powerful people in the world, some of the least powerful people in the world, and he was always the same person. And I think by a long stretch, the most evangelical president in modern times, and was so intent on living out his faith in a serious way. And you know, this is a guy at age 95 who's still out building, which is just unbelievable. And I think he built in recreation and had fun too, but had such a deep sense of purpose and such a sustained commitment to serving others. Also so remarkably gifted. I mean, it's hard to think of a person who could go so deep in nuclear engineering, agriculture. He wrote his own study Bible from his 60 years of teaching Sunday school, and of course could talk about world affairs and solving tropical diseases around the world. So, quite a Renaissance person.
Wow, must have been amazing to spend time with them both. Thank you for that. You shared a little bit about how your journey led you to your current position. One of our audience members was curious about how your experiences in the for-profit sector and business school benefit you when you run the nonprofit that is Habitat for Humanity. What skills should nonprofit leaders have, and how should students prepare themselves to be future nonprofit leaders? Can you expound a little bit on that?
Such a great question. You know, all the skills are needed. All the skills that make you successful in the business world are also needed in the nonprofit world. So we need great finance people and great operations people and great technology people and great marketing people and, in a way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the language is not the same. And so I would encourage is to, it's really interesting. More and more, I believe we need more multi-sector leaders and we need more translators. So we need bridge building from one side, but the other kind of bridge building is the nonprofit world faith world, government world, business world all speak different languages. So I've actually observed people who aren't even disagreeing, but they're not understanding each other. They're just talking right past each other. And so I'll give you a funny example. I mean, when I came to Habitat, a core business idea is getting a return on investment. We're going to invest money, and what are we going to get? What's our mission impact? What's our financial return? Now, when I would say that to a bunch of Habitat mission-driven nonprofit folks, they would just glaze over. But if I talk about stewardship, people are like, oh, yeah, we should be good stewards. Well, it's really the same idea, but different language. And so I think all those skills are needed. And I would say if you're in the nonprofit side, it's helpful. I view myself as bilingual between the private sector and the nonprofit sector. That's useful. And I think we do need those translators. But I think it's helpful to understand, wherever your space is in the nonprofit sector, you still need to be really good at whatever your, the way that you want to contribute. And I think in a way, the days where, I don't want to say this ungenerously, I experience sometimes in the nonprofit and the church world, both the missionaries, people with world-class talents, gifts, and skills who are there because they really have a sense of calling and want to make the world better. And there's a small group, but I would call refugees from accountability, who are like, well, I'm working in a nonprofit, so I don't have to be accountable. I don't have to. And that would drive me crazy, because it's like, wait a minute, we are using other people's money to do God's work to help people in need. Our bar should be way higher than the private sector, not lower than the private sector. And so I think we have an enormous imperative around good stewardship of our precious resources.
Thank you for that. A lot of questions are coming in about policy, and I found it difficult to choose the best one, but what policy shifts do you think need to happen to increase affordable housing in the U.S.?
Oh boy, that's a big one. So I'm going to give you a few. We could spend a month on this one. We need local, state, federal, and global, but let me hit just a couple. At the local level, we need to make it faster and easier to build. So there's a lot of 1980s zoning put into place that was really to replace racialized, and there were a lot of places that just had pure covenants that said no Black or Jewish or other people can live here. When that became illegal, they were replaced with essentially economic covenants that anyone can live here, but only if they can essentially afford an upper middle class life. And a lot of those do not make sense. And so we have to change zoning, and that's hard. NIMBY is one of the rare areas of bipartisan agreement in our country. And so, but it's really important. And they're really good examples. Getting rid of parking minimums, getting rid of minimum lot sizes are two very direct ones. Atlanta has an example where if you're bringing a mixed income, mixed use development is the best human development for everyone. It's the best for the environment. It's best for the families. It's actually best for everyone, not just the lower income families. And it helps with the social mobility issues. But we have increasingly in the last 50 years actually gone the opposite direction and created economic segregation, which then correlates, unfortunately, with racial and other kinds of segregation. And so it is... So we have to change that. One of the things cities can do that doesn't cost much money is fast track on the making it easier. So like City of Atlanta said, if you bring mixed income or low income housing, we're going to put you to the front of the line, and we're going to make it a lot easier to get through the entitlements process. Because sometimes even well-intended, California, super liberal state, made it impossible to build housing through really poor policy and a lot of obstruction. So that's local. State, you can do housing finance, and there's a bunch of policies we can talk about. And you can do statewide zoning reform. So interestingly, some conservative states have actually wiped out some of those things. Texas just got rid of parking minimums and minimum lot sizes on a statewide basis. And they very cleverly market it as libertarian. You can't tell people what they can do on their land. I thought that was genius, but really important. So Montana did the same. Utah is doing the same. So states can play a big role. And then federal is super important. And actually, this is we just had Habitat on the Hill. I think some of our friends were there with us. And we had about 500 Habitat family members in Washington just 3 weeks ago. And the House just passed a major bill while we were there, 390-9, Housing for the 21st Century. And the Senate is taking up their version of it right now. But this will be the biggest federal housing legislation in the last decade. And federal money is a big piece of, a lot of times when people think their state or local government is doing housing work, they're actually doing that with federal funding. So federal funding does matter to the overall housing mix. So that's a few pieces, but there's a lot.
And one thing just to add there, Tasha, because I was having conversations with several of you outside, is just the role that oftentimes faith communities play in housing.
Thank you for saying
and
that.
thinking particularly the assets that faith communities often have with properties and in ways to aggregate that into affordable housing, or maybe they need to have a mixed use space, or their time as a congregation in this space has shifted. But that's another place where I think faith communities can really be a big player.
I so appreciate you saying that. This Yes in God's Backyard is one of the really lovely things that's starting to happen, and we're seeing faith communities building housing, and I think and it's harder to turn them down. They too will get opposition sometimes, but I think that's incredibly exciting. One last one to permit is accessory dwelling units, and that's a way to get soft density and help with our mismatch, because we actually have more square footage of housing than we have housing that fits our population. So we've got a lot of older folks living in lots and lots of housing, more than they need, and then lots of young families that don't have enough housing. So if you allow accessory dwelling units, you're both getting opening up density in communities of opportunity, but you can also flip it. So you might have a single widow living in a big house, does not want to leave her community. If she can actually move into the accessory dwelling unit, she can rent her house to a family. That gives her income. She can keep the house in her family to pass down to her kids, and not have to leave her community, but you're actually better matching your square footage to the needs of the community. So I think there are a bunch of ideas out there. It's getting the social will to actually make them happen. But I think the faith community can play a big part.
That's super interesting. And thank you for responding to that question at the local, state, and federal level. Let's go international. So how do you and your team navigate communicating internationally with different governments and processes when building or working outside of the US?
Yeah, we know within Habitat how frail we are, how many things we need to do better, all the challenges, but housing tends to be quite local. So there are not many global housing organizations. So in a way, it's both an incredible privilege and responsibility that we are at some really important tables. And I would say even bad governments need good housing policy. But one of those tensions I talk about is, what do you do if you're working in a place and the government is doing terrible things? And yet you still, if you care more about the people sometimes than they appear to. But we still want to figure out how to make it work. I mean, a couple of positive steps, which I think is a reflection of how bad the housing crisis is. Last year was, in a way, a momentous year for housing. And I actually believe, a little bit jaded on this, now that middle-class families' children cannot afford housing in the communities in which they grew up, it has become a political issue. We already had an affordability crisis before that, but it was more invisible. Now it's become visible. And this is all over the world. This is everywhere. So last year, the European Union, for the first time, took on housing as an issue. And you're like, how could that be? But they did, at least. And they invited us to help design their housing program with an extra $30 billion. The Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development, the OECD, for the first time took on housing. And we were the only NGO that was invited to the table as they launched that. The UN, for the first time ever, had a presidential level housing session at the General Assembly, and led by France and Kenya, and Habitat was the only NGO that was invited to speak and participate. And so the good news is, I think people are leaning into housing in a way that I've never seen before in my time. The bad news is that's because, unfortunately, we have such a gigantic crisis. But it is hard. I mean, one of the saddest things, I'll give a not so happy example. We had to suspend our work in Haiti last year. And I hate that. We've been there for decades, and we do really important work, and we have a wonderful team there. But it got to the point, everything is so broken and so dangerous that we couldn't feel like we could keep our staff safe or actually execute our programs. And that's just heartbreaking. So that's the sort of the worst example of if government is just not functioning.
Well, Jonathan, we're so grateful for how generous you've been tonight with your time. And I guess my last question from our audience, and again, there's so many more, and I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them, but in what ways has your role at Habitat enabled you to live a life of generosity?
Mm.
So, what other nonprofits are you an advocate and supporter of?
Oh, that's so nice. I think one of the things that I had to struggle with as a young adult was really owning my faith was I didn't want to be a hypocrite. It's like could I commit to this and try to live up to what that meant. And I would say in the same way, there's so many good causes, and I try to follow the advice that that we give to others, which is rather than, I would say I give widely if there's, you know, any of my children or any of their friends or anybody that we have any connection who's raising money for a cause, I'll give something because I just want to encourage anybody who's willing to put themselves out there to try to go raise money. But we try to pick a smaller number of things that we really support more deeply. And our local church is one of those. You'd be shocked. Habitat is one of those. And because my wife and I met and my dad taught at UNC, we support a number of initiatives at North Carolina. And then I have, I could give you a long list, but the International Justice Mission, my friend Gary Haugen does unbelievable work, and we support them. My wife helped start their work in Uganda long ago, and I think they do great work. We have a daughter with special needs, so we support NAMI, which does advocacy for mental illness. So we give to health. So we try to give a lot. My dad was a great role model. He was a professor and didn't have a lot, but always was incredibly generous. And we've tried to have a model. One of the things I spoke to a big conference of Christian MBA students just last week, and one of the things for those of you who are students to think about is money is complicated. And I'm speaking to the experts now, so you all know more than I do about this. But I think what I've encouraged, especially business students, but I think it's good for all students to think about is even if you want to make a lot of money, that's fine, but build a pattern of generosity from the very beginning and think about intentional generosity. And I encourage live beneath your means if you ever think you want to move towards mission-driven work. And one of the things I'm really grateful my wife Ashley was very supportive of is we always live beneath our means, which both allowed us to be generous, but also gave us the margin that when we felt called to move into the church and take a huge family pay cut, we could do that because we didn't have the golden handcuffs, which can be really tough. But I think most of all, it's the joy. I mean, I think for those of us, I was terrified of fundraising when I took this job. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to go ask all these people for money. This is gonna be hard. And Dave and I were talking about it. I mean, it's the switch for me, and I actually found this in the church before I came to Habitat, is, when my mindset shifted from I have to get money from this person to I have the opportunity just to talk to this person about what their dreams and hopes and aspirations and how they want to have impact in the world. And some of the time that's going to fit with our mission, and that'll be awesome, and we can do something together, and sometimes it won't. That took a lot of the pressure off. And so I tend to, I have great empathy for those who are having to raise money, but I'm also quite clear with an awful lot of people who come to fundraise to say, look, I have great respect for your cause, but it doesn't really fit, where Ashley and I are focused, and we want to have the most impact we can with our philanthropy. And so we don't try to do everything, but I do think it's I think all of us who give, there's just a joy in that, and it's the world feels like a better place, and you feel when you can make a connection and be personally connected to a mission that matters. And so I hope for those of you students particularly I hope you will find that intersection. And that doesn't mean everybody needs to go work for a nonprofit, though of course I think lots of great people should go work for nonprofits. But everyone can be out in ministry wherever they are planted. And I have a good friend who's incredibly generous and really good at making money. And he was going through a little bit of, maybe I should quit and go work for a nonprofit. And I'm like, maybe you should really pray about that. And if God tells you to, you should do it. But you're rare because you're good at making money and really generous. So maybe you should just be really generous. And I wasn't raising money for us, but I remember getting convicted very deeply by a friend when I was a young Christian thinking, okay, I'm definitely going to tithe, but it's like pre-tax or post-tax. And he's like, you are missing the bigger picture here. And his question was not how much of your money should you give? It was how much of God's money do you need to keep? And it's like, that's a much harder question. But sorry, I'm going all over the place on that. It's a good question.
Well, for your willingness to be here and to give your time, we are grateful. I'm going to invite my colleague Elizabeth now. Can we please celebrate Jonathan one more time?
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Jonathan, David, thank you so much. So appreciative. What an evening. I am like living with so many of the things that you've talked about, that were, as somebody who has volunteered for Habitat multiple times, I'm just surprised by but I'm inspired by as well, the catalytic way that you think about this work. It's inspiring me in the ways that I'm thinking about boards I'm serving on. Hopefully you were inspired by the way that he was speaking about that, of how you can take those ideas back to your own context, new revenue and economic models. I think God is our center, not our border. So good. The work, who would have thought that building houses was also about peace building, and building with, not for. I love all of that. Thank you so much. So appreciative. Maybe I think the other thing I'm living with is that maybe our communities are built very similar to the ways that our homes are built. Piece by piece, relationship by relationship, hope by hope. And you did that when you came in earlier today. Many of you filled out a popsicle stick and wrote what's giving you hope today. And while this was all going on, a popsicle stick home was being constructed. Out there, it is now waiting for you to observe.
Nice.
I have to tell you, it's astonishing. All credit goes to Amber, our a dear colleague at Lake, for putting this together, but I'm excited for you to see it. But it is a home built by you, a small home built by you, covered by the hope that you're carrying into this room and hopefully out back into your own communities. So check that out on your way. As you leave tonight, I hope that you're carrying not just words, but inspiration to figure out what is, I loved, was it your grandmother who said, how are you going to be useful? I love that. Sounds like something our grandmothers could have been friends maybe. But what is our role? What is our role to play here? Whether that's in building a home or in our ways, or in our generous living, or in the ways that we're advocating for the nonprofits we're passionate about, or the faith communities we represent. So I'm excited for us to walk back into that world, the rainy world out there. This was recorded tonight. You'll receive an email with a link to that. Please share it. I mean, I'm sure you agree. There is a lot to be shared that was in this, that only us in this room have heard, but others deserve to hear as well. So please share that recording. It will be made available to you. And you'll also be getting some other news from the Lake Institute, if you don't already, to be paying attention to the other work that's going on and other ways you can get involved. So we are so grateful for you. And again, round of applause for Jonathan as we head out tonight.